Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Campus Research Colloquium. This is the second to last talk of this academic year. And I'm really thrilled to have Associate Professor Alexis Patterson-Williams speak to us. I've been wanting to listen about Alexis's recent research. I mean, of course, I heard her speak a while ago, but recent research. And it's really wonderful to have you here, Alexis, because I love to hear from the speakers themselves about themselves. I think that's much more fun. And so I'll let Alexis tell us a little bit about herself. And she will talk today about sustaining disciplinary literacy in science, a transformative just model for teaching the language of science. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Marielle, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this talk today. It is week 9, and I am sure everyone may be hitting that proverbial wall. So thank you all so much for taking out the time to come. My name is Alexis Patterson-Williams, and I am an associate professor in the School of Education. I was asked to say a few words about my journey into the academy, and I have to say that journey probably started in elementary school when I knew I wanted to be an educator. Probably as long as I can remember, I wanted to teach. And so I kind of planned K-12, K-16 accordingly. I tutored all throughout middle school and high school. I tutored my peers. At UC Berkeley, I majored in psychology and geography, and I worked in various classrooms in the Oakland area to really strengthen my teaching ability. I became a middle school science teacher after that, and worked as an intervention instructor at an elementary school as well, supporting 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders in their learning of English language arts, math, and science. And it was really at that point in my teaching career that I thought, I want to be a principal. And so I went to Stanford to get my master's in policy, organization, and leadership studies. And then it was at that point that I realized I do not want to be a principal. That really where my passions was in teacher education and training teachers and supporting curriculum development and things of that nature. And that is a very, very, very minute aspect of what principals do. And so at that point, I pivoted to the PhD program at Stanford, and I received my degree in curriculum studies and teacher education with an emphasis in science education. And so from there, I did enter into the professorate here at UC Davis. I am really grateful to the campus community for welcoming me in as a fellow from the beginning. They, as well as my peers and colleagues in UC Davis, have been so important in making my time here really humanizing. And this is now my home. And so I'm grateful to be here and to be able to share my work with you all and so many of my campus peers that are here today. And this talk is based on a recent paper. The paper is entitled Sustaining Disciplinary Literacy in Science, a Transformative and Just Model for Teaching the Language of Science. And really this paper represents a little bit of that journey from graduate school into being a professor. This paper is the coming together of various scholarly identities. In graduate school, I did a lot of work around literacy and science. And this paper really forced me to build on that early work in literacy and science and begin to think about how my more critical work, which is a lot of what I am doing now, how I make sense of science literacy and what happens with science learning in the classroom, how that comes to bear on learning for literacy, and thinking about how do we make learning the language of science more just and transformative for students, especially those who are historically marginalized. And so I am grateful to the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy for really giving me the opportunity to kind of bring these different aspects of my scholarly worlds together. And so I'm just gonna jump right on in the talk. Hopefully that was enough about myself. So this talk really hinges on the premise that literacy and language are essential components of science. Reading, writing, and talking are paramount to the construction of science knowledge and to learning science in general. Engaging with the language of science is central to science learning and is becoming an emerging priority for science teachers. One of the main reasons why language and literacy instruction is becoming more acknowledged in science classrooms is because of the combined emphasis that the Common Core State Standards and the Next Generation Science Standards play in requiring students to communicate with each other using academic science language and practices. You see from the diagram on the right that there is an overlap across math, science, and ELA when you compare both documents, and that language and literacy practices are represented across the three disciplines. So for example, read, write, and speak grounded in evidence, construct viable arguments, come to the perspective and culture of others via reading, listening, and collaboration. All of these things represent the language and literacy practices of science. And I really want to dig into this just a little bit deeper. So when you look at the work of Barber and Pearson, they outline that science is made up of reading, drawing, writing, talking, and the doing of science. They highlight how, despite the centrality of language and literacy, research shows us that the public often really focuses on the doing part, right? We're all excited to get in the lab and do and tinker with scientific things. This is a huge part of the public conception of what science is, and it's often ignores, or the public is often unaware of the importance of communicating about process and results. And so we also see this play out and kind of trickle down into more traditional forms of K-12 science instruction. The focus is on inquiry, discovery-based learning, or the doing of science. But when we look at the literature, we find support for the assertion that literacy is an important part of the development of new knowledge and the construction of ideas within the enterprise of science. And this notion is starting to trickle down in the classrooms as well. So again, if we look at the NGSS, the practices include all of these kinds of literacy activities, developing and using models, engaging in argument from evidence, etc. If we dig deeper, we see that writing and arguing are core practices of science, according to the work of Norris and Phillip. Tenneper and King talk about how engineers and scientists spend more than 50% of their time reading and writing. They did a deep ethnography of scientists, and this was one of their findings. And then if we go back to the classroom, what we do find is that although reading and writing are a large part of what happens in the sciences, children really have difficulty understanding science texts. And these texts are mainly have various features of writing that really make comprehension challenging. And so in 2016, some colleagues and I wrote a paper really arguing that the role of the science teacher is to teach content as well as the language necessary to engage with science. So the science teacher is also a language teacher. And we argue that because they are language teachers, it is essential to understand the difficult text features. It is essential for them to understand the difficult text features of science text so that they could support students in engaging and accessing the text that ultimately students will have to engage with in order to read and write in science. And so we identified features of the difficult features of science text. So this includes vocabulary and the way that it is used. For example, anomalization is one of the things that we see where a process is turned into a noun. I call it the shunnification of a word. So for example, we have words like evaporation, we have words like condensation, deforestation. And these words, they really actually represent a complex process. And so it can be confusing for students to see, these long lists of nouns, which really represent things, interconnected processes that are happening. So if you think about the water cycle, which consists of condensation, evaporation, precipitation, um, each of these words represents a process. And if you think about a science text that is explaining the water cycle, if they don't understand what condensation is, they would get lost along the way as these words kind of pile up. And so we can think about the pile up of these very content packed words as creating very lexically or informationally dense text. Also, difficult features of the text include the passive voice, the syntax or the sentence structure, and oftentimes we take for granted that the graphics and the diagrams are require their own set of literacy skills to be able to decipher and make sense of. So these are the features of text that are very challenging. We don't argue that teachers should become functional linguists, but we do argue that they should understand these features so that they can really support students in comprehending the text by breaking it down. We offer them some pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading strategies in this paper to help support students in comprehending science text. And, at the time that we wrote this, kind of thinking back on the journey in the academy, we were really proud of this paper when it came out. But as I sat down to write this paper for JAL, the Journal of Adult and Adolescent Literacy, I began to realize that so much of my work had been compartmentalized. This was the science literacy work that I did when I was in grad school, and then my own work as a scholar, as an independent scholar, was really thinking about how do we flatten social hierarchies and bolster transformative and just learning. And so these two things had really been separate for me. And so in writing this paper, I began to think about that there was a missing piece in the way that we were talking to teachers and really encouraging teachers to approach literacy and science. And so really the process of developing disciplinary literacy in science, it's important to understand that this is not a neutral act. And if all we do as teacher educators, and this applies for higher education instructors as well, is supporting teachers in understanding the difficult features of academic science language and provide them with reading strategies to make the text accessible, that as a singular step is really limited. It does not account for other features of the text that really could be harmful and challenging for learners. As I stated, learning language is not a neutral act. Language is steeped in meaning and has an impact on students. And so I really want to unpack this statement a bit. It may feel counterintuitive, like words are just words. How could they be harmful? It may just not be obvious the various ways that the acquisition of disciplinary learning in science and engaging with the language of science can bring about strong negative emotions in students. And so that's what we see when we turn to the literature. One of the things we know about academic language in science is that it's more associated with middle class and white middle class values and interests. So while there are gains to using the language of science, particularly for those who are focused on social mobility, there are also losses. There are losses because language and identity are inextricably linked, right? Such that students really have to make a choice in order to enact a particular identity. So that means when I'm using a language, I'm not just using words, but I'm choosing a particular identity that that language is associated with. So when I'm giving a presentation like I'm doing today, I'm using standardized English. I'm choosing a particular vernacular, and that signals to some of you perhaps that I'm scholarly and that I know what I'm talking about. And this is a decision that students make all the time because they want to put on a particular appearance. They want their ideas to be accepted and their contributions to be valued in the classroom. And that is the choice that I'm making today. And it's a choice that we often ask our students to make. So we cannot so easily separate language and identity. One of the things that James G. argues is that while there are gains to using the language of science, there are indeed losses. And he explains it like this. He says that the acquisition of academic language is tied to the learner's willingness and trust to leave the life world, which G describes as their everyday language, and participate in another identity, that is the specialist language of science, one that for anyone represents a certain loss. But for some people, it really represents a more significant loss. So because students often feel they have to choose between the correct language of the classroom or academic language and their own personal vernacular, it can be alienating and off-putting when they are faced with the language of science. It can be off-putting to have to make the choice. So G goes on to say that given science academic language close association with middle-class values and interests, the engagement with science academic language may require a greater disassociation from the everyday language of students who are not from that background. And so G asks this question, which I think is a really important question. He asks, why would a child be willing to accept these losses or make that switch in identity? And why would a child want to give up their life world language? Why would they want to give up their home language to make that switch to the specialist language of the classroom? And it really prompted me to ask the question, what right do we have as educators to make such a request of our children? And I challenge you as instructors to think about why we make this request of even our undergraduates, our graduate students. We know that there is a benefit of social mobility, and in higher education, folks are trying to perhaps enter into a career where this language is useful. But there's a lot of research that talks about the efficiency of using science language, but oftentimes the use of that language and the teaching of that science language is done in what Angela Valenzuela would call a subtractive way. So while I argue that we need to teach science academic language, we have to move away from using the kind of subtractive approaches that devalue the life world language or the everyday language of students in order to teach disciplinary literacy and science. We need to do it in more additive ways. And so when you think about the work of Django Paris and Samuel Lean, they give us the language of culturally sustaining approaches. Teaching the language of science using culturally sustaining approaches is what I argue we really need to embrace no matter what level of students we are teaching. And that's teaching science that is additive and really honors students' various language practices and their identity. It honors and heightens the status of students' life world language instead of measuring success solely by how well a student takes up white middle class norms or take up the academic language of science. With that said, a culturally sustaining approach is more just and more transformative approach to science instruction that really extends the understanding of the complex nature of science language to move beyond academic science language as the only appropriate way for students to make sense of phenomenon and really allow students to use their everyday language to do thoughtful science work in the classroom. And really, this is what science teaching is all about, right? It's all about sense making with phenomenon, not just learning the language that categorizes the phenomenon. And I argue in order to do this, teachers need to make two major commitments. And these commitments include prioritizing literacy and decentering whiteness and dominant academic language in science instruction. So with that said, in order to have a more humanizing approach to scientific literacy, I offer the holistic science pedagogy as an approach that attends to students' emotional well-being and attends to it as a means to identify when harm is happening in the classroom. And I am talking about this from a K-12 perspective, and towards the end of my talk, I'll really kind of dig in a little bit about what this might mean for a higher ed perspective. But the WSP is a more transformative and more just approach that also embraces and is in alignment with science standards and science research. And if you're not familiar with that, I am going to try to, oh no, I had a link that I can't capture, but I will just flip to the next slide and we will go to the commitments, and I will try to get that link out to you all so you all can see it in more depth post talk or maybe during our Q&A. But the holistic science pedagogy is a student-centered approach to teaching science that really requires 5 commitments from the teacher. And this is a framework that my colleague Selena Gray and I developed a few years ago based off of our dissertation work as well as our teaching experiences. And so according to this framework, the holistic science pedagogy asks teachers to make these 5 commitments. The first is a commitment to an ever-developing self-awareness. The second is a commitment to science and its practices, a commitment to science as a transformative agent, a commitment to students and their social emotional well-being, as well as a commitment to utilize restorative practices. And I will talk through most of these in a little more detail, outlining the commitments as well as giving out some practices towards science language instruction. So the first commitment is a commitment to an ever-developing self-awareness. And this commitment really encourages teachers to be critically reflective and develop a critical consciousness to begin to interrogate themselves, their beliefs, to understand their positionality, and really begin to deconstruct the mindsets that might be steeped in oppressive and perhaps even white supremacist views. And if you go to the Center for Transformative Justice and Education, this is a center that can be found on UC Davis's School of Education website. Selena and I just did a talk emphasizing the value of this commitment. This is a commitment you really cannot skip. If you do the self-work, you have to do the self-work to really understand the ways that we, and when I say we, I mean folks of color, as well as white folks, the way that we value dominant and standardized forms of language. We've got to be able to pick apart those mindsets in order to be able to engage in more culturally sustaining practices. And that's not really the focus of the talk today, but I want to emphasize this because I often think that we as teachers want to skip past this step because it is the most challenging to kind of look at oneself and to look at oneself critically rather than thinking about how can I plan or how can I spotlight or be more representative and bring these kind of structural things into play and critique the structures. But we also need to be able to think about how we might be perpetuating these things ourselves. So what does it look like? When you've done this deep self-awareness work and develop a critical consciousness in this way, we see teachers begin to set the standard for what is the appropriate form of language use in their classroom. As I stated earlier, it begins to move away from this kind of oppressive view that the only appropriate language in science or the best or correct answer in science is the one that uses academic language. But the teacher begins to understand that harm occurs when we take that approach. And we can elevate other language practices and linguistic choices of our students to the same status. Instead of treating youth speak as a bridge to a higher form of language, we can treat them both as equally valuable as equally valuable as ways of making sense of ideas. A holistic science teacher would learn from the different communities about the deep histories and bring in their funds of knowledge that are really essential to resisting stereotypes. And as I've said before, really welcoming students' repertoires of language and knowledge as a way to help them make sense of the world and to bring that language into the science classroom. So the next commitment is the commitment to science and its practices. And I think this is one that I often highlight for K-12 teachers, not maybe as important or as necessary for higher ed scholars, because most higher ed science teachers are scientists. But I wanted to say a little bit about it. It's important, I think, to highlight because oftentimes this commitment really requires that teachers encourage students to use science as a means to make sense of the world around them. But it also is about teachers constantly engaging in the development of their own content and pedagogical knowledge. So that means understanding the current best practices for good science teaching. And this is something that can apply in higher ed context. This includes incorporating the science standards, understanding the science practices, common core ideas, the disciplinary core ideas that are also highlighted in the NGSS, especially if you live in a state or area that is embracing that in the K-12 arena. And then really bringing to bear, bringing these standards and these practices to bear in a critical way to really support students thinking about and making sense of the world. So what I'm not saying is that students don't need academic science language. But what I am saying is that we need to bring a balance where we're not prioritizing or valuing one over the other, but that we are really embracing what students bring to the classroom genuinely and seeing that as valuable and useful. Next, I talk about the fourth and fifth commitment, which asks teachers to attend to the social and emotional well-being, as well as incorporating restorative practices. So the fourth commitment is asking teachers to notice the social and emotional cues that students exhibit in the classroom. They have to be committed to monitoring, encouraging and supporting students' social and emotional well-being. And I think this is particularly important in science, where historically it's been viewed that emotions do not have a role in science, and that science is an objective space. And that has really trickled down into science classroom environments, K-12. But I also think in lab spaces and in office hours, this is really a place where we can get a gauge on how our students are doing and whether or not the classroom environment is having a kind of negative influence on them. But as I stated earlier, emotions really can be a signal for us to think about, the kind of discomfort that students are feeling, or maybe the disengagement or harm that they might be experiencing because of something that happened in the classroom due to language or maybe other social hierarchies that may come up in group work or other experiences. So we can use emotions as a way to begin to make sense of what our students are experiencing, instead of shying away from those emotions, but really looking in to see how we might respond and best support the student. And so to students, and this action or response to me really represents the enactment of Commitment 5. This is a commitment to restorative practices, which is really making amends between students and the discipline. Because engaging with science academic language for some students can be distressing, a holistic science teacher would really take an active role in noticing the emotional expression of their students and taking an action to address harm that might possibly be created by the lesson. This commitment, I think, is really important so that we don't lose students along the way. We know that there is a concern about a leaky pipeline or missing links in our bridge, whichever metaphor you want to use. But we've got some pockets where students are not persisting in science or desiring to engage in the field. So we don't want our students to lose interest. And I think that that's something that we may be using emotional cues to think about how we can begin to mend bridges for our students between who they are and their identities, and also who they are as scientists, and that they can have a meaningful science identity. Just talked about that, so I'll keep pushing. So as a science educator, I think it's really important to kind of close out thinking about the practicality of these ideas presented today. So I want to end my talk thinking about how we enact a culturally sustaining approach to disciplinary literacy. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll kind of dig a little bit deeper into the higher ed context. So for me, translating the WSP into practice means that teachers need to attend to, as I mentioned earlier, the emotional behavior of students. Emotional behavior really can be point to moments where students may choose to disengage from a task. And so by noticing what students are and are not doing, we can recognize and attend to students' needs, well-being, and provide them the kind of social and emotional support that they might need. When we talk about noticing, there's a whole literature around that, and noticing is really about being able to attend to particular stimuli within an environment and make sense of what we're seeing, and then take action to respond. And so hopefully some of that language is really connecting with you all as you think about your role as instructors, that you have opportunities, to engage beyond the content and to really connect with students, and thinking about the ways that we make sense of students, what seems like disinterest or disengagement. That really is a part of, I think, the work of that ever developing self-awareness, that we really reflect on what are some of the narratives that we have about why certain students don't engage, and why others may not. And so if there's some bias imbued in those interpretations, it may cultivate negatively phrased instructional talk in our engagement with students. And we want to be mindful of that. Lastly, from the K-12 realm, the work of Dr. Brian Brown really recommends that science teachers begin with students' everyday language when teaching new concepts, and only provide academic terminology once these ideas are firmly understood by students. And again, this really highlights the importance of valuing students' language and increasing the status of that talk authentically in the classroom. And so I'm going to transition there and really just think about a focus on a higher education. And I have my student, Annalisa Brown, who is in class right now. She couldn't be here, but I have her here because she really is my inspiration in terms of focusing on higher education. I am a through and through K-12 science educator, but in working with her, it's really been pushing me to think about what is the role of scientists and science educators within the higher ed context, to think about the holistic science pedagogy, culturally sustaining practice, and what that might offer us for the work that folks are doing in the college and university context. And so there's a quote from Love, and it says, "The burden is placed often on Black students to overcome hundreds of years of institutional exclusion and figure out how to make the institution work for them. They must learn how to have a good relationship with students, faculty, and staff who hold racist attitudes and stereotypes about them, and feel free to act them out as peers and power holders in institutions." But it's important to recognize that Black students and historically marginalized students, they do thrive in higher ed STEM spaces, despite this burden, despite feeling maybe some hostility in STEM higher ed spaces. And they do this through assimilation, through counter spaces, counter structures, and other strategies. Historically marginalized students have been found in the research to find ways to adapt and persist. And they have that kind of navigational capital that Tari also talks about. However, the onus, and this is really Annalisa's argument, is that the onus should not be on historically marginalized students to thrive, but that higher ed STEM spaces must be student ready to truly serve minoritized students. And I really want to shout out the work of my colleague, Dr. Marcella Cuellar, who studies HSIs and really encourages Hispanically serving institutions to think about, are we really serving the students that we are trying to, that we say we are? And that's what I really want to push in this talk today, for us to really think about, are we serving our students in our departments, in our courses? And so one way that we can think about serving them is through culturally sustaining practices. And the holistic science pedagogy gives us a little bit of a framework to think through that. So going back to commitment one, critical self-reflection and critical consciousness, which is a huge part of this ever-developing self-awareness work, really asks us to examine our instructional practices and to consider whether they're steeped in deficit views of minoritized communities. That can either be through our language practices and ideologies, or in our views and responses to students. Deepening our work, this is more about the critical consciousness, but really we want to deepen our understanding about what Gloria Ladson-Billing calls the educational debt, as well as the opportunity gaps in STEM education, as we begin to frame and maybe understand why certain folks are not as fully represented in STEM fields. It's not about a community's disinterest in STEM or inability to thrive in STEM, as much as it's about historical implications from white supremacist policies and structures that are still having an effect today, even if by law certain things have been dismantled. The third commitment, which is about teaching science as a transformative agent, I'd really, want to push us to consider, how are we presenting science? Is it, is our pedagogy one that is culturally relevant, that incorporates knowledge from multiple communities? Do we think about indigenous and native ways of engaging science and knowing? Are we strictly steeped in a more westernized approach? Are our instructional practices dynamic, and do they highlight how science is meaningful for life and greater global causes? Or is it really just about like learning a kind of flood of vocabulary? And one local example is through Scientist Spotlight. So there's a lot of research where folks out of San Francisco State, so Kimberly Tanner and Jeffrey Shinsky out of Foothill College, have been using these kind of Scientist Spotlights to cultivate representation and a sense of belonging, and showing how science learning is more relevant for students from historically marginalized groups. And last but not least, thinking about commitment 4 and 5, think about educating the whole student. So really creating humanizing spaces within our labs, our classes, and our departments. Really taking the time to be reflective of the culture that is being cultivated in these spaces, and not taking for granted in the ways that our spaces can often be microcosms of the kind of social hierarchies that we see out in the broader society. So we have to be actively disrupting those hierarchies. If not, they will just maintain and persist. And we do that by developing norms for interactions. I know it may be silly, but I am a firm believer in developing norms for our interactions in labs and collaborative spaces, and really taking the time to notice where inequities might be happening, and having the courage to address them. And then provide opportunities for hearing and healing. When students from minoritized backgrounds tell you that something is amiss, they're feeling microaggressed or microassaulted, let's start by believing them and thinking about ways that we can create healing and restoration in that space. Our institutions can be a space for thriving, particularly for historically marginalized students, whether that's a K-12 institution or a higher ed institution. The question for me truly is, where do our commitments lie? Our personal commitments, our policy commitments, our structural commitments. If we are willing to make these changes, we can create learning spaces where all of our students flourish in our institutions. Thank you, and I welcome your comments and your questions.
Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. If people have questions, you can write them in the chat, or you can just unmute. And the format of the campus colloquia, we have an hour and a half allocated for this session. So we usually have Q&A, and it naturally evolves into a continued discussion. So yeah, feel free to stay as long as you want and listen and contribute to the conversation. Yes, Natalia?
First of all, thank you so much for Alexis for the talk, and that was fantastic. My question is, when you're thinking about the implementation of these changes at the level of faculty, what are the barriers that you think are most significant to having these changes take place?
Yeah, I was like, somebody's going to ask that question. As I was preparing, thanks to Talia. You know, one of the things that I think about as a barrier is academic freedom, and we all love our freedom. So it's not that academic freedom is a bad thing. But I think part of the challenge of academic freedom is that it's a place where folks can say, I don't have to do anything I don't want to do. And I think that, to me, that bumps up against the first commitment, right? The commitment to an ever-developing self-awareness. And so if we're not aware of the smog, and this is Beverly Tatum's metaphor, but she talks about how our society is smogged or bogged down with oppression from, you know, various angles, whether it's patriarchy, whether it's heteronormity, whether it's racism, sexism, you know, think of all the isms. That is the smog that we all exist in, and we're breathing the smog in. And if we don't do the kind of active work to detox or deconstruct that we perpetuate that. And so part of that can come in the form of language ideologies, which is what I highlighted today. But it can also come in the ways that we think and engage and interact, structure our lessons. And so if we are not willing to engage in that kind of work where we're reflective of how students are experiencing us, experiencing our curriculum, then I think that, to me, that's one of the major barriers, because we don't have to, and nothing's going to happen. And so I understand the history of academic freedom, but I think that because that self-awareness work can be challenging, that we can maybe use that as a way to kind of continue the status quo when it would better serve our students and, frankly, ourselves, to maybe do some reflective work around our instructional practice, or the ways that we show up in our lab, or the ways that we engage our advisees. That's just one, but one of the ones that really, I think, stands out for me.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Ellen Marie Osborne. She appreciates your talk, and you talked about only introducing academic language only after everyday language has been used to set a foundation of understanding. Can you elaborate on some other concrete ways teachers can clearly show and explain how academic language will not be elevated in their classroom?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things that, you know, I read about is really, first of all, talking about like, what is the purpose and the goal of academic language? It's not that academic language is this horrible thing, but understanding that it has a purpose. It is super efficient, right? To be able to say the water cycle versus trying to describe all of what we mean by the water cycle. and think about the language in your field. So it is purposeful, but I think a lot of times we can hide behind language. And so if a student is describing or explaining a phenomenon using the language that that is their own, that is authentic to them, I think that being able to hear what they're saying, to be able to repeat it back, to show where sometimes there might be oversimplifications, and then being able to kind of talk at in that kind of everyday language, your everyday language, not needing to pare it back, whatever their vernacular is, right? But being able to leave the academic language behind to have that kind of conversation and then layer it on. I think it's not about not going there, but it's about saying that these things have different purposes, and that for this purpose of sense making, we can do this work. And now at the final assessment, so at the summative assessment, you know, part of what I want to see you all be able to do is to engage in sense making, but also engage in using the kind of academic language that's also going to be useful in the field. I'm teaching a class on scientific literacy and this quarter, and I have students that are both from the sciences as well as from education. And we were having a conversation about these ideas, and you know, that one of my students was saying, you know, as a TA, I'm grading these papers and I can see that the students are, you know, have made sense of this idea. And so technically speaking, they have the like right answer. But because what we, you know, what is the answer key is that they have to say this exact phrasing. Because they didn't use the exact academic language, they don't get credit, even though they have explained the academic idea. And I think it's that kind of binary approach that really says that it doesn't matter that you understand it. It's what matters is that you can utilize this label of academic language. And I think that that's a lot of, to me, that's one place where we see this kind of devaluing happen. And so I think if we can make explicit when we feel like it's a particular time and place for certain language, but also that we value the understanding, the concept, the content knowledge versus just being able to label and categorize. So that is a skill, but not the most important. I think for me, that's some of the ways that I engage in that. Thanks for coming, Bree. It's good to see you. Ellen, if you want to follow up with your question, I don't see any other hands or anybody in the chat, so. Dr. G.
Hi.
Hey.
It's so good to see you. Thanks so much for your talk, Alexis. Really appreciated your thoughts. And I've heard this talk before, but it's great to see it evolve, and especially placing it in the context of higher ed as well. I have a question for you around the 5 commitments for teachers. And I'm wondering if you can expand your thinking on what are the commitments that schools also need to be making? Because some of what you're getting into also, I think, relies on thinking about the role of schools in promoting socio-emotional wellness for students, as well as restorative practices, right? So this is not just kind of contained in a teacher's classroom, but I think we can also think of this in terms of a whole school approach. And I think there's also implications for higher ed institutions, right? So not only just placing it, you know, not only making just individual instructors responsible, but how do we create kind of a broader shared commitment that the school is engaged in? So can you maybe say more about that, or have you kind of been thinking about that?
Yeah, you know, I think it's an important question, and I think it's, I'm thinking just back to the work of like Jeannie Oakes and how she talks about how different educational leaders, their different journeys of really trying to shift practices in their classroom. And I think WSP teaching, while maybe those commitments are evidenced by, you know, all 5 are evidenced by some, or maybe certain teachers hold some commitments over others. to see that kind of play out across the whole school really will require, I think, a shift in a lot of different schools, institutions in general. And so I think putting on this kind of like organizational leadership hat, I think is where that, for me, where this question hits. First of all, you know, what is the mission and the vision of the school? And do these commitments shine through in like who we say we are and what we say that we do? This kind of these kinds of statements, I think, are where people look to see, you know, what are we all about? Who are we? The mission statement, I think, is something that really anchors and grounds an institution or an organization, whether it's schools or broader. But then I think, you know, we have to go beyond the kind of broad stroke statements and think about how are we enacting it and how are we as leaders investing. I think a lot about administrators and principals, right? If we take this beyond isolated learning spaces, how do we invest our teachers, our staff, our counselors in these commitments, right? And so I think it's also about bringing people along with you. I think this is the work of deans and department chairs that we have to think about. How do we not just say we have to do critical race theory, which, you know, what does that really mean, right? I think this gets back to doing this kind of work around our commitments and our ever developing self-awareness, making that tangible. But how do we get beyond just saying like you have to do social justice in your teaching, or you've got to attract more diverse folks? Like, how do we invest people in that vision? How do we make that vision tangible? How do we assuage some of the fears around it, debunk what it means? We have to go beyond sound bites and like trendy language and really invest money and invest time and buy people out of courses or give them, you know, prep time if we're thinking K-12, so that people can do this work. Because when, where, how, right, is it going to happen? So it's a resources issue, as well as like thinking about motivating people to do the work. And then there's the policy issue, because a lot of times we can say do these things, but policy doesn't align with that. So I hope that got into that a little bit.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you. I wonder if Ellen Marie, if she's still here, if you want to ask the next question. I don't see her here. Oh, maybe she'll send you her question. Oh, if you're, yeah, sorry, I didn't see you. Do you want to follow up?
Yes, it's here.
Okay, there
it's ready.
Yeah, so I'll read it out loud. At this month's Anti-Racism Symposium at UC Davis, PhD candidate Cesar Hoyos Alvarez talked about his research titled Supporting Bilinguals' Emotional Well-Being in the Language Classroom at UC Davis. Well, I'm glad you're asking this question because that was in my mind. About bilingual people or even immigrants. He highlighted how ESL learners experience a unique shift in identity that can make them feel alienated, not only in the classroom, but also at home. This seems to tie directly in on your point that students can feel lost when trying on a science identity. Can you talk about ways you would support these students and invite their identities into the classroom, especially at an HSI?
Ooh, that's such a powerful question, Ellen. Thank you so much for it. You know, I have to say it really reminds me of a conversation that we had in my scientific literacy class with a student who said to me that science, as an English language learner, science was actually her safe place until she got to college. And then all of a sudden, because of the demand for science language, while she understood the concepts, the demand for science language made her second guess her identity as a scientist, and that she was really struggling in the science space. And it was really heartbreaking. And part of what she found was she felt validated by some of the readings that we did in the course that was critical and asked questions. And so I think one is, how do we make space where people feel safe enough to express the loss that they are feeling, right? These tensions and how and we might be perpetuating this kind of or creating experiences institutionally where students feel like they're in kind of a no man's land, like home is not home anymore, school is not home, like where do I fit? So I think it's important that we really are active, even in our classrooms, thinking about how do we create these kinds of spaces where people can bring themselves. For me as a Black woman, it means that I bring all of my linguistic repertoires into the classroom. To me, that is an active choice that I make to be my whole authentic self. And that to me is very important, because if the students can see me being me, um, you know, being my mom self, being my Black self, being my professor self, like all of these beings can coexist in this space, and I am representing that for them. Then I think that they're seeing it happen, they're reading about it in the kinds of critical works. We certainly have seminal pieces in there, but we also have critical pieces, and we talk about both sides of it. I think that that's important, what's being represented in our syllabi. You know, there are social structures that I think we need to create, these kind of counter structures or these counter spaces where students can go and talk to other folks, and there can be, like, I too have felt this. I know that Campos has been that place for so many women of color who were integrating into the professorate here at Davis, and I'll never forget, and I don't remember who said it, but I'll never forget when one of my colleagues talked about wanting to lose their accent so that they didn't have lower evaluations, because that's real. And I think we can't shy away from these kinds of tensions and the kind of ugly ways that that students really feel marginalized. And I think that when we as the kind of representative authorities in a space can really bring these things to the fore, however they make sense and manifest in your classroom, I think that then students can feel like we are safe places to have these conversations in the first place. We can't just want to be safe places, but we have to actually extend our hand and be vulnerable and authentic, whatever that looks like to you, given your background. That to me is what invites students to open up and to share these things, is by creating these spaces for them. Hopefully that was a little more practical than preachy. And feel free to dig deeper if it wasn't.
No, that was wonderful. Any other questions? I mean, to me, so you talked about the importance of language literacy, and I kept thinking, if we teach the language, then we're moving in the direction of teaching effective science communication, which is so important. So part of the reason why the public is antagonizes science in a way is because they don't understand it, and they've grown up in these systems where there's all this language barrier and all this jargon. So they reject science, and now we're in the middle of a pandemic where really we need the public to understand the scientific discourse, but we're terrible at doing it. And this needs to start with the scientific literacy early on. So this it really ties closely to with science communication. And you talked about academic freedom. I mean, in my culture, my freedom ends where I start hurting someone else. And that doesn't seem to be the case in the discourse of academic freedom in academia. If my freedom to ignore the pain of the students or the feelings of inadequacy and the fact that minority students are falling through the cracks of the system, if my freedom is causing that, then there's a problem with that, right? Because I'm actively causing harm. And how can we address these with the people? So I think there's people who don't know how to do what you're recommending to do. And if they were given like practical guide, they would try it. And then there's people who are like, no, I don't care. I don't want to do it. And it's my freedom to not do anything.
Yeah.
It wasn't the question, it was just a rant. But
I appreciate the rant. And I think that that's the fundamental tension that we have in this country today, is that if my freedom can encroach on yours or your well-being, is that what the Constitution is all about? I think that's the reckoning that we have to have today, that if the Constitution is about my rights, and if my rights mean that your rights don't matter, or that you are harmed, or that you are devalued, but we've upheld the Constitution, like is that what that means? Is that what the intentions were? And even if that was the intentions, are we okay with that? Is this not something we might want to address and reconcile to create a more just and humane society? And you know, what are people willing to do to make it not okay for some to be free, but for others to feel marginalized and oppressed? I mean, I think that that's the question that we have to ask ourselves and really have to have some hard answers about, because until we can come to some kind of, maybe not a unanimous agreement, but a majority agreement that, you know, we're not okay with folks being run out of science.
Yeah.
So we're going to continue to see get what we have. Yes, Lillian.
Yeah, I would have first thank you for your talk and bringing this conversation, because what you and also Maria were talking about reminds me, you know, like I think that we in science, you know, once we got to higher education, we also need to be, there need to be some level of preparation when we're in graduate school or even in the postdoc training, how to, you know, communicate science in lay terms, you know, to lay people, right? Because I think that, you know, when you look at reports last year from, you know, how many people had died in the current pandemic compared with the Spanish flu after 102 years of scientific advancements, Nobel Prizes, vaccinations, so many things that have been within that 102 years in between one pandemic and the other. And we were not kind of advancing kind of as we were expecting. You know, there was still a lot of loss, and especially a lack of trust from the community at large of what we do in the scientific enterprise. You know, where sometimes we're perceived as Frankenstein still, you know, even, you know, so how we can fill that gap again, how we can go back and reimagine ourselves how we would talk about science when we were younger, when we were so enthused about science and we would talk to our parents, oh, I want to be a scientist, right? And they were like, well, yeah, okay, go for it. You know, back then we were able to explain what we like about science in lay terms, because we are still not kind of embedded with this kind of identity that now I am a scientist, I speak science among scientists, but I still don't, I forgot how to address my neighbor or my mother, you know, how to explain what I do in ways that will be relatable to them. So we can regain the trust, because it's something we have learned from this pandemic is that we are not being trusted, right? And you know, the people prefer to follow the advice of a celebrity that might be a very good singer or a very good actress, but not a scientist. You know, they prefer to follow their advice about and their choices in terms of vaccination, mask mandate, etc., instead of trusting what sound scientists are saying.
Yeah, I think, you know, this pandemic has kind of bust wide open this issue that has been in existence for a while, that people feel patronized by science and scientists, and that people have historical reasons to distrust science and scientists, that science has been used to perpetuate harms in certain communities. And so I think gosh, come to my class, Lily, and we can talk about this all day. This is all that we talk about, which is really just thinking about like, what does it mean to be scientifically literate? And can you be scientifically literate if you are only able to talk in the jargon of the field, but you're not able to communicate it to the polity who also need to be making decisions and really trying to grapple with science communication, and if that's a part of what it means to be scientifically literate. I think as we have operated as a field of scientists, that kind of science communication is like its own separate field, right? It's not a part of like, the milestones or the expectations of what a scientist is able to do, or that's an important literacy skill. And I think that we have to rethink that model, and we have to rethink that approach, and that so what does that mean for how we design coursework? We certainly have a set of values in mind in the ways that coursework is designed now. I was looking at Bree's comment in the chat and just thinking like, currently there is a huge valuation of language, right? The ability to read the textbook to get a greater sense of information, etc. And that certainly leaves out a group of people. But for what purpose? I was having an argument with somebody my first year here who was like, well, then how do we tell Chevron like who the top 5% is? And I'm like, well, what if we told Chevron like we have a top 95% and here's this very diverse pool? Assume that everybody knows what they need to know to do the job, and then you need to find a different set of criteria to determine who you want to hire. What would it be like if that was the world that we lived in, versus saying that we have to exclude people in the ways that we teach them because it's not effective? And really what we're testing for is language ability versus the ability to understand the material and innovate. So thank you, Amelia, for coming.
Can I follow up on that really quick?
Yeah.
This is running through my head as I just had lecture today. Okay, so just for clarification and context, I do education research in higher ed on STEM classrooms with STEM students, and I've been out of the practice of teaching physiology for a very long time. And today I was talking about, we were in the reproductive lecture, and I was talking about pregnancy, and I was like, yeah. And so the baby gets stored for 9 months in the uterus. And I was like, clearly you can tell that I'm not using a lot of scientific language, because I understand the process, but I don't remember the scientific language sometimes, like even as an instructor. And so it's like, at what point do we require our students to have that kind of language? I mean, clearly they're not going to have it if I don't teach it. But is it going to increase the pool of students that come from disadvantaged backgrounds for getting into something like medical school? Do they need that language in order to exhibit their knowledge on the MCAT test? Or, yeah, so I'm just playing with that idea in my head.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And, I like what you're saying reminds me of a class that I taught around equity and democracy in our teacher education course. And I remember the instructor, who was the lead instructor, I was a graduate student at the time, so I had a section, but the lead instructor brought in this person, and they were like, this is this great teacher, she's this great equity advocate, and basically she was like, I taught my students poems, and this was my English language arts curriculum for my 11th and 12th graders, and they're these great poets, and they could really talk about their pain and hurt in these beautiful ways, and isn't it beautiful? Look at their their journals where they're writing these poems. And I'm like, yeah, that's great that they had a place to be able to articulate, the hurt and the harm, but how were they able to go forward? And did you just make a choice for them? by not providing them with the tools that they would need to be able to engage in these other spaces, right? And so I'm not okay with that either. I think, we have the tools to choose whether or not we use certain language or not. And I think that we need to give our students the choice. But part of giving the choice is that we put all of the language on the same playing field. We talk about the purpose. So Ernest Morel talks about like a critical literacy or a critical English education. It still teaches students how to do the reading of the dominant text. But what it also does is it gives them a skill set to be able to be critical about the power that's imbued in the text. What's in the subtext? What's not there? Who's missing? What other text can we bring in to bring to bear on this conversation? What perspective are we, not engaging? So it's doing that plus, right? So it's not saying, don't give the kids the academic language. Of course, they need the academic language. They ought to be able to be exactly who you are if that's who they choose to be. So I don't believe in like taking the choice and the agency away from our students. I believe in us, kind of pulling back the layers and allowing them to understand the nuance and the complexity and let them figure out where they want to fit into that conversation. To me, that's the empowering approach for our students. But it also allows for us to say, ooh, that was a bad metaphor that I just used.
Yeah.
I'm blanking.
Totally.
And I'm like, mom brain, the fog is there. Let's go to the text. Like, let's go to the text and engage in the text. And then like, let's grapple with that. And what was your understanding? And thank you. Now I remember. This is the better way to explain it. And this metaphor I used worked in these ways, but this is where it fell apart, right? And to me, that's a real and authentic and honest, and I don't always have it together, to conversation. And that's the beauty of being able to Google some terms or use the text or pull up an article. And so I think that, to me, that creates a space where students are like, okay, well, Dr. Tripp is also a human, and, how do we embed that throughout our courses and the way that we present ourselves? I think that, to me, is the bigger picture.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Don, for your feedback in the chat, for coming. Feel free to unmute if you guys. I definitely see myself in a lot of what was just said. I have a very bad memory. So when I'm teaching, I'm always looking for the terms, and they ask me, so do we need to memorize? Like, no. This is math, you don't need to memorize. I mean, you need to know what are the key concepts of what I'm teaching you, and you need to be able to explain it in your own words. But then you go back to the testing. I mean, you were mentioning about MCAT. I mean, if they're going to be tested on specific concepts because things have names and the test has to be short, well, I don't know how short it is, but it has to be concise, then of course they need to know what those words mean. But they should not be expected to just give the answer from memory from the book, right? And like we need to be open to students explaining in their own words. And that again goes back to being able to explain concepts for a broader audience in a way that is accessible. And if it takes longer than something that you can explain in one sentence, jam-packed with technical terms, you wind up explaining in 2 paragraphs because you don't remember the technical terms. That's okay, because that shows deep understanding that goes beyond the memorization. And some fields are better or more amenable to this than others. But certainly, I mean, that's how I have always operated, for lack of memory, if anything else.
I super appreciate you sharing that. Do I pronounce your name Mariel?
Mariel, yeah, Mariel.
Yeah. Yeah, it's my first time teaching this class. So it's like, every single day I'm like, oh, actually, I'm going to explain this a little bit different. I teach, it's a four days a week class, and it's a beast, but I appreciate that I'm not alone.
No, you're absolutely not alone.
Yeah, I think the question in the chat about, the factor of evaluations, right? I mean, when I share the comment that someone said about wanting to like practice, kind of decreasing their accent, it was because of teacher evaluations, not because of their intelligence, but that an accent, certain kinds of accents, right? An English or a British accent is probably very, cool to some people and doesn't have some certain derogatory connotations, but that a thick accent from, spoken from a brown person, signal certain things which it shouldn't to students. And so I think to me, this is a part of like the policy conversation. And when we write up our materials to CAP, first of all, is there like a STED training for CAP where they understand about like these kinds of historical ways that evaluations happen? What are the kinds of questions that we're asking that might surface some of these biases? I think that there are ways around it, but again, that's a kind of policy thing. And I think we as individuals have to think about how much we want to like kind of be bound to these evaluations. I show up and I use the language and I have citations and I do these midterm evaluations, but I'm also me and I'm gonna be me and I'm gonna talk about I am choosing to show up like this because look, the week we talk about language, I'm doing this on purpose. And so the ways that you saw me go back and forth between different linguistic repertoires, I was doing this on purpose. And I shouldn't have to feel like I have to be somebody else in order to be seen as smart. I have a PhD. Somebody's already assessed it. And so, feeling comfortable to say these things out loud to students, and to talk about when we're doing evaluations, like, I am human. I am not perfect. I want to know how to make it better, but I don't also want to be beat up by you. So please be thoughtful in the things that you write. And please don't wait till like week 10 on the final evaluation. Come see me in office hours, write it in the midterm evaluation. But I think that that's, a personal comfort level as well as things that like the university and the system can do.
That brings a couple of thoughts. Lillian, who just left, she gave a brilliant talk on linguistic profiling a few weeks ago. It was recorded, so you can probably find the link through our website on campus, or if you want to put the link in the chat. That was very interesting. And in my position as faculty director of campus, of course, I'm an educator, but I oversee these 34 fantastic faculty, most of whom are underrepresented minorities, some of whom are young assistant professors. So I have it in my mind that they also need safe spaces. They also need protecting, right? I mean, we always think about our students selflessly, but when you put yourself out, like you're saying, Alexis, you're putting yourself in a space that is not safe for you. And you might decide, no, I don't feel that this is going to be safe for me. Therefore, I will adapt my language and my persona to give my students what I think will be the less controversial. And that's something that we don't think enough about, that it's also the well-being of the faculty themselves. And I'm not saying that you don't, because I know that you do, but I'm just thinking a lot about that as in my position as faculty director, that the faculty also need that protection. And how do you make that choice? Like showing yourself as you are, as you said, I mean, without trying to eliminate the accent and or the jargon that comes from wherever you come from, be it the neighborhood or be it a different country. And at the same time, feeling that the students will be grateful and will be fine with that and will appreciate you the way you are. And that's not a given, because professors do face a lot of discrimination from the students. And Tom just put the link if anyone is interested in the linguistic profiling talk. Yeah, I see that it's 4:29. I want to be respectful of your time, and I know you have somewhere else to be. So thank you very, very much. It was a fantastic talk and really interesting conversation afterwards. I know that we all feel like we could stay here longer. So
thank you all so much. Thank you, Mariel, for the opportunity to come and share. Thank you, everybody, for such a wonderful conversation, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Have a great
quarter.
End of quarter and long weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Kevin.